Hope you're all doing well. I am in Copenhagen, Denmark. I just finished filming my last military embed of the year on the Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka axis. This was during that really foggy period where the Russians tried to make some breakthroughs in some areas because you really could see like 20 or 25 feet in front of you. And so I did a bunch of filming then, and I wanted to be sure that I could get home for Thanksgiving and Christmas and spend some time with my family before getting charged up to go back to Ukraine next year. So I'm staying in Copenhagen as a little vacation. I wanted to see there's a Christmas market that I checked out. It was quite nice. I wanted to see they have this one of the oldest running not a carnival. It's like an amusement park, one of the oldest running amusement parks in the world. I wanted to check it out before I head back to the States for the holidays. And so that's where I am currently, Copenhagen. And I'm not supposed to be doing any work because my boss told me I need a break. And when I mean my boss, who I write for at Offbeat Research, my editor told me I need a break. And I estimated I need a break. And I also need to go see a neurologist when I get back to the United States. And so due to some personal medical issues. So I want to take a break. But there are some stories in the news that demand that I come back and talk about them before my break ends next Tuesday. That's Tuesday of next week when I will be returning to full-time streaming. The first of those topics came to light in the last 24 hours, and that is a proposed peace deal between the United States and Russia. And I'm excluding Ukraine from this because the Ukrainians were not involved in any manner in inking this plan whatsoever. In fact, it seemed to mostly be done by Donald Trump's special envoy and real estate developer, and that's really all he has experience in when it comes to the professional trade. And I don't mean diplomacy. He doesn't have any experience in diplomacy. He has experience in real estate development. But this man who was supposed to be a Middle East peace envoy, mind you, wasn't even supposed to touch on the topic of Ukraine. He has become one of the top point men for the administration when trying to negotiate a deal, going to Moscow and meeting with Putin and his entourage on multiple occasions, even sometimes relying on Putin's personal translators to do his translating for him. Mind you, again, this is somebody with no expertise in the region who is constantly leaning on no one in order to make these leaps and bounds in diplomacy. And surprising to no one, it has not borne much fruit. It has not borne much success. But it's him and Kirill Dmitriev, who is one of the members of Putin's personal envoy, who has been, many would say, dragging along the president's envoy and the United States in negotiations for quite some time now. Now, this deal that they inked together seems to just be a reaffirmation of Russia's previous demands made without the Ukrainians in the room. Now, this deal is being proposed, or at least talked about, to the Ukrainians at this point. We're hearing from White House officials that they're starting to float it around Europeans as well. But I also don't believe that this was meant to get to the public yet, because there was quite an embarrassing, I don't know what you would call this. I don't know. You wouldn't call it a scandal. I'll just call it a HR or a PR hiccup, where the story was tweeted out first by Axios. It's an Axios scoop. U.S. secretly drafted new plan to end Ukraine war. At David Lawler and report for Axios, yada, yada. And Steve Witkoff replies to it as if he was texting somebody, as if this was a private communication. He must have got this from K. K, of course, probably meaning Kirill Dmitriev from Putin's inner circle. So it looks like Steve Witkoff did not expect this information to come out at this point, and in fact also does not know how Twitter works. Again, this is the man who is the point man for the administration on negotiating with the Russians for an end to the war. So what is this deal that reportedly does not have Zelensky very happy and seems to be a reaffirmation of previous Russian demands? Well, the deal has a few components to it, and I'll break it down, but it seems to be only addressing Russian demands with zero interest in addressing any Ukrainian key demands. Now, the first thing that I think immediately discounts this proposal from any Ukrainian perspective, which is what I think immediately makes it a non-starter, is that it cuts the Ukrainian armed forces in half. And in fact, I've even seen some statements from, I believe it was the chief correspondent for The Economist, the chief correspondent when it comes to foreign affairs. He said that it might actually be as much as 2.5 times. So we're talking about a majority of the Ukrainian armed forces or at least half of the Ukrainian armed forces being done away with. Mind you, it is the current size of the Ukrainian armed forces which is getting all the reports from the Russians, from the international press, from the Ukrainians themselves, that they're having manpower problems. And so, in the current state of the Ukrainian armed forces, where they're having manpower problems and where the Russians are crawling forward in Pokrovsk, the Russians are crawling forward in Seversk. We got some recent negative reporting that they had actually moved around defensive positions on that axis, negative for the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as the Russians pushing forward on the Dnipro-Donetsk border, on the Zaporizhia axis towards Hulipole, the ancestral home of Ukrainian anarchist leader Nestor Makhno. And so in that current state, this deal is saying that's too much. It has to be cut by half or more than half. And considering that the Ukrainian position is, not only do they believe that their territorial integrity should be respected, not only are they clearly defined that Ukrainians and Russians are different and they should be treated as such, they deserve their own state, but they're also trying to make sure that nothing like this could ever happen again. Zelensky's state of mind, in reference to the war, to be explained in any way, in 5 seconds to try to get it through to somebody, it's to stop the cycle. It's to make it so the Russians cannot invade again, that this type of war is not passed down to another generation of Ukrainians. And so in 20 years, I'm going to be doing more reports outside the city of Kramatorsk, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, instead of, I don't know, playing whatever garbage grand strategy slop is going to come out in 20 years by Paradox Interactive, which is what I would rather be doing. But instead, this is what I'm doing, and I would like to not be doing it for 20 years, and I don't think the Ukrainians would like to be fighting wars for 20 years past this point. But if you get rid of half of your armed forces, that seems like an invitation for somebody who's seen what they can do with double that size to invade again, especially if the leadership of that government still believes that your country doesn't have a right to exist, which Vladimir Putin does, especially since they have not ever given up the idea of Ukraine only being able to exist as an extension of Russia or not at all, which is what Putin wrote about in his essays that he released shortly before the war. Why would a president be releasing essays shortly before a war? Well, that's because Putin is a Reddit tier history nerd, and that's why he rambled on Tucker Carlson's show. That's why he rambles when he was talking to Trump privately about Yaroslav's horse and why it belongs to Ukraine and XYZ. This type of stuff really matters to him. It might not matter to you. It might not matter as much to me, but this type of stuff matters to him. And until he abandons that, as well as his long-standing physical aspirations, which we can see every day, Ukraine getting rid of half of their armed forces seems like them putting a lot of trust in the Russians to not invade again, which they've promised not to do multiple times before, including in 1991, 2014, and so on. So that's the first part of it. And yes, that's already a lot to ask of the Ukrainians. In fact, already too much to ask of the Ukrainians from Kiev's perspective, but that's not it. There will also be no foreign troops in Ukraine. We've talked a lot about, and even the Americans, this administration, Trump's administration, has talked a lot about foreign troops, French troops, German troops, Italian troops, never American, but French troops, German troops, Finnish troops, Swedish troops, European troops holding the border between Russia and Ukraine, as well as the gray zone between Russian and Ukrainian positions in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. And these peacekeepers, you could call them European defense forces, whatever you would want to refer to them as, would essentially stop a future Russian invasion, because if the Russians were to try to, double up on their invasion, take more territory, and try to settle it any other way than peacefully, these troops would then have to not only defend themselves, but it would trigger a diplomatic crisis in all these European capitals, where many of them might likely send more troops and then be fighting a ground war in Europe. And the possibility, the threat of fighting a ground war in Europe alone is supposed to be the disincentive. No, there was never a lot of American troops in Berlin. It wasn't the American troops physically in Berlin that stopped the Soviets from barreling over the city. It was the implication. Okay, it's the fact that if they went and they tried to take Berlin, they'd be in war with all of Europe. There could be an atomic element to that, and it was just too much of a risk for Soviet leaders, despite the fact that even some of the most hardline Soviet leaders wanted to take it. Stalin, of course, made a series of decisions that led to the Berlin airlift, but they didn't because of the implication. And so it would work in a similar fashion. Well, this deal says no to that at all. In fact, it also says no to any planes. So it wouldn't just be no ground forces holding the line, but it would also mean no French, German, Italian, British interceptors that could be taking down Russian long-range missiles that barrel towards Ukrainian energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, residential apartment blocks, uh, military factories, civilian factories, energy production, any of these things that are going to be crucial for Ukraine, both during and not during wartime. But it doesn't end there. There's also going to be a ban on long range weapons that can reach both St. Petersburg and Moscow. Ukraine has worked during the war to develop its missile and long range drone attack capabilities in order to bring the war back to those who bring war to them. This means that we've gotten to development of pretty more well-known missile designs like the Flamingo, which have started to be used in some instances, but the quantity of it is still up to question. We hear some reports from defense companies that want to make it look good, and we see the actual physical impacts, which are a lot less compared to that, but they are starting to make some impacts. And of course, the much more prevalent, the much more seen, something that many Russians have gotten a lot more familiar with, long-range attack drones, which the Ukrainians are producing more this year than in any other year of the war combined. 2022, 2023, 2024, put it all together, and we're talking about maybe half of the amount of attack drones that the Ukrainians have been able to produce. This is not Ukrainian propaganda. This is not Kiev, the Syrskyi has come up and declared. Go read Russian reports about impacts, how many times they've shot down a drone and then been damaged by falling debris. It's gone from single digits to double digits to triple digits. And the reason it has is because the output of these drones has increased in excess capacity because the Ukrainians saw an opportunity to bring the war back to the economic machinations that allow them to carry the war on, i.e., energy production, the refineries that take crude products and refine them to higher ticket items that they can sell in foreign markets for a larger price when the Russian energy sector, especially the state companies, are feeling real pressure. And that's where 33% of Russia's budget comes from. So that's something that Russia sees as a weakness that they've suffered, that despite all of their high-tech anti-air capabilities and all of the glory of the Russian army, one thing that they can't change, no matter how many times Putin, sends an order to go beat this officer or that officer back in line and take another offensive, is geography. They can't change what God did with the mountains. And considering that Russia is the largest country on the planet, that's a lot of ground to cover. And if your economy is going to be so based in the energy sector that's so spread out across your country, it's not really possible, at least in this point in time with current technology, for the Russians to protect everything. And so it's been a major weakness that has led to about 1/5 of Russians, over 1/5, might be at like 1/4 at this point, of Russia's refining capacity being knocked out. We've seen in many areas of rural Russia having queues for fuel in Russia, a fuel behemoth. And that's not due to the fact that they've run out, like, oh, we ran out of dinosaur bones. It's all over now. No, it's that if you take out the infrastructure by which you move something from point A to point B or you refine something, you can have all of it in the world. It doesn't matter. The same problem is happening in Mali right now with the Russian-backed junta that kicked out the French and then brought in Wagner. Wagner then went belly up. Now they're dealing with the Russian defense the Russian, defense ministers, and they're not really up to stuff compared to the people before. And so the capital of Mali has been under siege by Al Qaeda, not because Al Qaeda has giant, tanks and missiles that they can go and they can barrel towards the capital, but simply because they targeted the fuel lines into the capital, strained it. And so now there's giant fuel queues that last for days. And so the Ukrainians used Russia's geography against itself, and it exposed a massive weakness in Russia's infrastructure. And the Russians don't want that weakness to be seen. They don't like that weakness very much. They don't like green eggs and ham. They don't like it Sam I am. They need that to be gone. And how do you get rid of it? Make it so the Ukrainians can have long-range missiles. It's not just that the Ukrainians had to give up their atomic arsenal back in 1991 for a guarantee that the Russians would not invade again. Now they need to give up any capacity to fight back, period, in order for the Russians to agree not to invade them again. But mind you, not only would they be giving up this tool that has proven very effective against the Russian war machine, they would also be giving up land. And that is the next part of this deal, which is ceding territory. It would not freeze the lines where they are, which is what Trump has said again and again and again since he has been inaugurated, based on his 24-hour framework. That should be where the war ends. Just freeze it where it is, leave it be, everybody stop dying. This sucks, war's bad. stop the bleeding, then you put on John Lennon's Imagine, and then everybody smokes a doobie and go home. Okay, that's this dream that Trump has in his head, which is a stated dream because it doesn't really acknowledge the physical reality of where the Russians are, where the desires are, and where the diplomatic standard is currently. But according to this deal, the Ukrainians would have to cede the rest of the Donbass. That means Seversk, that means Slovyansk, that means Kramatorsk, that means all Dobropila, that means all of these places which the Russians have not been able to take in combat, and that there are currently defensive positions put in where there are heights over Kramatorsk. I was at those Kramatorsk heights 5 days ago, and you can see for miles and miles and miles. And these heights and defensible positions are locations where if the Russians had to take them with force, that they could lose tens of thousands of soldiers, that they could lose a lot of troops, they could spend a lot of resources, and it could take them a lot of time going into 2026 in order to capture them. Kramatorsk is a city of 500,000 people. Pokrovsk was a city of about 50 to 60,000. To give you an idea of the scale of the urban settlements we're talking about in comparison to each other. And to put it bluntly to you, Kramatorsk would be the last stand of the unoccupied peoples of Donetsk. I go to Kramatorsk, and when I meet people from Severodonetsk. I meet people from Donetsk City. I mean, they used to live like right next to the Donetsk airport. I meet people all over occupied Luhansk, which is now at this point 100% occupied. I meet people from Mariupol. I meet people from all across occupied Ukraine, but mostly occupied Donetsk. And to lose Kramatorsk, to lose the last large city unoccupied in the Donetsk region, which is now widely used and seen as the capital of Free Donetsk, is essentially to give up Donetsk. Not forever, not to say we diplomatically recognize it, but that would mean they would have no physical hold on it. And having territory, holding it is a big part of it. It's not just, I have this piece of paper which international law says it is mine. The Azerbaijanis, they might be able to say international law says that we have Nagorno-Karabakh, that that's ours, but they use physical force to say that that is ours, right? And then, what happened with the huge displacement of people after it was taken. So when it comes to Kramatorsk, this is going to be a vicious battle. This is defensible territory. This is land that means a lot for the people who live there, and possibly displacing over 500,000 people, many of whom who have already lost their homes. Some people, they've lost their home like 3 times. I meet people who was like, oh, I used to live in Donetsk. Okay, then I moved to Chasiv Yar. Well, obviously I had to leave Chasiv Yar. Now I'm in Kramatorsk. And some of them are just like, we don't want to leave again. We're not going to leave again. Some will, some have, it's sunk in that this is their life now, but many will not. And so this is a huge sacrifice to ask the Ukrainians, both when it comes to the people who have to live in these communities, which is what I think is most important, both for Ukrainian public morale and the whole nation and their national psyche, but also just due to military logic. If the Ukrainians gave up these locations, this could give the Russians a clear shot over largely wide open fields to Dnipro, Zaporizhia, to flank Kharkiv from the south. And so you would have to assume, after already giving up many of these things, which are considered non-starters, that the Russians would truly stop. But if Ukraine can't have foreign troops to protect it, can't have foreign planes to protect it, has to cut its army more than in half, doesn't have any long-range munitions, even the domestically produced ones. It seems like that seems to be the goal for the Russians, to completely eliminate their ability to send long-range munitions back at them. What's the disincentive for restarting the war on the Russian side? I mean, really, from the Russian perspective, this is the sad conclusion I came to, is if I was Vladimir Putin, this would be the deal I would try to get out of Donald Trump if I either wanted to cripple Ukraine so that we could abuse its weakened position to get concessions out of them that otherwise we could not have, i.e., hey, you want to do this, or, well, we know where you stand defense-wise, or B, if I just wanted to relaunch the war, period, again, and try to finish what I had started. And that leaves you with the 2 things that Putin said in his essay. Either Ukraine exists as an extension of Russia, that it can be manipulated as part of the larger Ruski Mir, or not at all. So to me, this is a non-starter. But the fact that we're 11 months in, we're about to head into December, Christmas time's around the corner, Thanksgiving is literally, I can see Thanksgiving down the road, and 24 hours was what was thrown to us. 24 hours, and we're still playing around with the same deals that the Russians would have pushed on day one on Steve Witkoff and the rest of the gang. Mind you, this happens at a particularly vulnerable time for the Ukrainians. Number one, this is at the same time that there's a quite sizable corruption scandal in Ukraine. Ukrainian state energy providers have been found to be giving 10% cuts off the top to state officials in order to get contracts, i.e., hey, buddy, you want a contract with the government? Well, you better be willing to give a 10% kickback to X, Y, and Z official. And a lot of these officials are people who, I mean, there's justice minister, former energy ministers, current ministers in Zelensky's cabinet. You got people who have been working with Zelensky, not only now, but working with Zelensky back when he was, doing stuff in the entertainment industry. When you're talking about Tamir Mindich, somebody who was working in the studio that he co-owned with Zelensky, who literally fled the country due to the charges against him, since he seemed to be the man running the operation and was running it out of the back room of an apartment of a Russian spy. Greed will make people do many things, scary things, dastardly things. But this has weakened Zelensky's image. This has weakened Zelensky's government in the eyes of much of the public. If you're a Ukrainian soldier fighting on the front lines and you just got back from an assault where you just lost like half your unit and you're trying to think how you're going to keep doing it, as you're hearing about the escalating cases of AWOL, of more and more soldiers just saying, screw it, I'm going to go home. What type of effect does this have in your psyche? I remember being on the front line talking to soldiers about Nabu being gutted, and the ones who didn't know anything about it, they didn't seem like to be too interested. But the ones who did know something about it, and when you conscript much of the population and you push them to the fight, you're going to get the people who do pay attention, and you're going to get the people who don't pay attention. And the people who did pay attention, they were not happy. And many of the people who do pay attention are some of the best soldiers in the Ukrainian armed forces. And so this situation happening right now, this being what's being talked about and what's being presented to Zelensky, at this moment where he's facing this not only domestic backlash, but also international backlash, is quite concerning. Now, mind you, I'm not happy that there's corruption in Ukraine. I am happy that Nabu called it out. I am happy that the fact that these organizations were able to retain their independence after Ukrainian civil society stood up and said, look, we're not going to allow President Zelensky or under the direction of Yarmak, who is basically, second in command. He's one of Zelensky's managers. He has like 5 managers, but he's definitely the most well-known manager. We're not just going to allow you to eliminate their independence. They got up, they stood up, they fought back. And what happened? Zelensky backed down because Ukrainian civil society survives while Russian civil society is dead. And you could never imagine something like that happening within Russia itself, challenging the president himself, holding up signs showing Zelensky like Mini-Me and, Yermak like Dr. Evil. That's not something you can do over there. But because of that strength, they were able to avoid that outcome. And now Nabu has over like 1,000 hours of audio recordings and more evidence is going to be presented with time, as time goes on. I am interested to see whether the current members of Zelensky's inner circle who are currently overseas on long-term business trips are going to come back because they could be possibly facing charges. I'm interested to see if Zelensky's government is going to stop some of these jailings, because there are jailings of Nabu investigators. There's at least 2 that are behind bars right now, whether or not he's going to decide that now's the time to maybe shift course on this and not allow the managers to manage more of Ukraine's industry into their pocket. Now this is bad, period. Thankfully, it didn't affect anything that had to do with aid. So we couldn't say, oh, German aid was wasted. It had to do with Ukrainians losing their own money. So congratulations, Europe. You didn't get scammed. Just the Ukrainians did. Yippee. Fantastic. Gorgeous. But this is something that could, of course, wound Ukraine's image, but is necessary. It is antibodies of the state looking at corruption, identifying corruption, and going after corruption. It shows that they are willing to do the cleanup work when given that independence. Because all the other organizations that were at Zelensky's discretion or were people that could have been appointed by him and his inner circle, none of them acted. None of them acted, and many of them were close associates with Yarmak or those in his circle, and it wouldn't be surprising as to why they didn't act. And so this independence and the actions of these Ukrainians did end up helping when it comes to the long range fight. But when it comes to this moment right now, it's a bad image for Ukraine. And so maybe the belief is that in the middle of this corruption scandal, which is necessary for Ukraine to ever grow, is that there's going to be a scandal here and there as you flush out the criminals. If you're going to bust the Gambino crime family, you're going to have a few high profile cases. To use this moment when that PR image is weak, as well as when Pokrovsk is clearly falling and the fight for northern Donetsk has begun, when Hule-Pole, the Russians are at the gate of it. This moment, I don't know if it was strategically used or strategically chosen to be the one when they start moving on this or start negotiating this, because to be quite frank, the Russians have dragged along the United States government in negotiations for 11 months, going on 12 months now, which with very little repercussions. People talk about the United States is not going to be sponsoring Ukraine anymore, but that hasn't been happening for the entirety of the Trump presidency. There are no more big aid packages. Susan Collins and other Democratic and people on the other side of the aisle, Democrats in the Senate, they have packages sitting there waiting. None of them have been acted upon. The government have shown no interest in acting upon them. There's, deep hunger across the aisle for some action further taken against Russia to bring them to the table, and the administration has chosen not to pursue it. There have been some slight squeezing, tightening of the sanctions, but even Marco Rubio came forward and said, look, I don't know how much more we can really tighten sanctions. There are areas that they can tighten sanctions. There are other areas where they can go after the shadow fleet. There's a question about how vigorous you go into enforcement. But this is the stuff that you expect from people who have an experience in statecraft, and we are dealing with John Trump. So this is, in my mind, a non-starter. This is not going to go anywhere. I hear some White House officials talking very hopefully about this, but I would not be surprised if all the people talking hopefully about this are people who have no clue what's going on the ground in Ukraine right now, who do not know what the sentiment is right now in Ukraine, because people see the AWOL reports, people see, Pokrovsk falling, and without the knowledge that the Russians wanted to take Pokrovsk this time last year. And they think, okay, so now is the moment to maybe push the Ukrainians to a concession. But if that concession is going to be giving Russia a bunch of territory at no loss to themselves, disarming oneself under the hope that the Russians will not invade in the future, and no soldiers in the country to actually stop that invasion, with maybe some verbal guarantees. What type of verbal guarantees? 91 verbal guarantees. This is just not going to get anywhere. Anybody talking hopeful about this deal, I think, is off their rocker. I saw that the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, Gur, he was saying that he expects this war to end sometime in February or March of next year. So if he's talking like that, it seems that he probably doesn't put much weight in these current talks or where it's going, and that the Ukrainians think that this war is going to drag on into the next year. And that was talked about as the soonest possibility for the war to end. Quite frankly, I do not see this war ending until sometime mid or late next year. And that is still me being hopeful that by then the war will be ending. That, maybe I reckon just by then they'll stop finding things to blow each other up with. Maybe by then the Russian economy will totally start to buckle. Maybe by then the Ukrainian manpower crisis will intensify to a point where they'll have to either take emergency decisions on mobilization that should have been taken months earlier, or they will have to come to some unsatisfactory conclusion to themselves, whether it will be the Russians unable to mobilize more people based on their military handouts, the big monetary deposits trying to put in Russians' pockets. They're not able to mobilize any more 50-year-old men. And so they have to take other actions like actual widespread mobilization that could be seen as unpopular, causes a public reaction. I don't know. There's a million different scenarios that could lead to a conclusion or a more rapid conclusion to the war next year or the year after that. But what I do know is that this deal at this point, facing this Ukrainian government in the midst of this corruption scandal, I could not think of a better way to cause internal chaos in Ukraine than to follow one of the worst corruption scandals, if not the worst corruption scandal of the war, where certain defensive structures that were supposed to be put in place around critical critical energy infrastructure were not put into place because the payoffs were not made at the same time that Russia's targeting them, if that's followed, where this whole operation is being run out of the back of a Russian spy's apartment, which I want to hear all the details about that. If that's followed by a decision to give up the Donetsk region after 12 years of struggle and give up the capital of unoccupied Donetsk without a fight, while cutting your army in half, getting rid of all of these Ukrainian drone and long range missile developments, it's just not going to happen because I believe that Zelensky is not both nationally and personally suicidal. So I don't expect much more development off of this outside of the possible repercussions. Look, we know that the Trump administration has been ebbing and flowing and swaying when it comes to negotiations. Whether they take a pro-Ukrainian position in the moment and say, hey, maybe Ukraine can win, or whether they take a position that, the Ukraine just has to kind of accept the writing on the wall as is. It sometimes depends upon, what side of the bed Donald Trump wakes up in, or whether or not he's switched his tampon or whatever it is that gets Donald Trump upset in the morning or not upset in the morning. But if this is rejected, we don't even know if this is going to lead to a negative outcome from Donald Trump. Because as far as I know, Donald Trump, we have no report saying that he approved this deal or this was the deal that he wants to go with. All we know is that this deal is being floated and that it was led forward by the worst negotiator of the Trump administration, Steve Witkoff, and of course, Dmitriev, because he's trying to put forward Russia's perspective. But let's say Donald Trump does look upon it favorably, or at least looks upon the idea of him being able to say, I've stopped a million wars all over the world, the known and unknown world, the known and unknown universe, then maybe he will decide, I don't know if I should be taking any further action, and he just sits on his hands for months. Or maybe he decides, I'm not going to approve this or that contract with Europe in order to give Ukraine these weapons. Or maybe he decides that certain intelligence sharing that he had put on block before, he's going to re-put on block. Or maybe he decides that he's going to retransfer strike authorization from certain defense officials in certain defense officials in European Command back to Elbridge Colby, who and Pete Hegseth, people who have not been very sympathetic to the Ukrainian struggle and have even at times undermined the president while trying to stop weapon shipments, which they said there were shortages of, even though many of the weapons didn't have shortages of. Elbridge Colby being a longtime opponent of aid to Ukraine, and Pete Hegseth being the Kyrgyzstan champion 2009. So we don't know exactly what the reaction from Washington is going to be when the Ukrainians reject this, because they will either reject it or they will offer an alternative that is basically the same as rejecting it. That's going to be so different than what Kirill Dmitriev put forward that I doubt the Russians are going to pay it any mind, besides saying that the Ukrainians are trying to derail talks. I don't know how they're going to react, but I do know it is going to be rejected. And how Trump reacts following it is probably going to set the tempo for the next month. And I only say next month because I can't say if it's going to be the next months or once winter is done, because Trump can flip-flop all we know. I mean, he can flip from one direction to the other direction quite quickly. For all we know, next month, Donald Trump is going to be talking about bringing back green Ukraine and how Chechnya must be liberated. While I find that to be doubtful, there is at least a gambler's chance, okay? If you were trying to do a under-over on it, it would have probably Buster Douglas chances. Either way, not much progress on the peace front. I don't expect anything to come of this besides a rejection. And the fact that we're still at this point shows that the administration is nowhere near serious enough on finding a real end to this conflict. And Trump is probably going to be known as, he was supposed to be known as a peacemaker, but he's like the feet dragger. And he's just going to drag his feet through these bloody, bloody fields until something else compels an end to it. Oh, I should also say, Marco Rubio did put out a tweet after there was a lot of reaction to the deal, not much of it positive. You're looking at Russian reaction. Here's what he had to say as somebody who's seen as one of the more pro-Ukrainian voices in the present administration. Ending a complex and deadly war such as the one in Ukraine requires an extensive exchange of serious and realistic ideas. Okay, well, you must not be talking about what I just read. And achieving a durable peace will require both sides to agree to difficult but necessary concessions. Okay, still waiting for a Russian one. That is why we are and will continue to develop a list of potential ideas for ending this war based on input from both sides of this conflict. Okay, so again, this right here, this deal was not made with input from the Ukrainian side. So that's a red flag right there. But again, this is supposed to be the most pro-Ukrainian voice there. This isn't an open endorsement of the plan. This isn't a declaration that it's a good idea. This seems to just be Trump in public saying, I mean, not Trump, Freudian slip, Marco in public saying, hey, look, we develop ideas. It is what it is. And if this is the best we can get out of one of the more pro-Ukrainian voices, that is a little bit concerning. It does show that Marco Rubio is trying to navigate in that room to be seen as, an essential voice on this discussion, as he's not trying to just go out there and shoot down the proposal. He doesn't want to get in the president's bad graces. But at the same time that we're being told that uh, that the other pro-Ukrainian voices in Trump's cabinet, I'm hearing that not Douglas McGregor, my gosh, Douglas McGregor, he's not far off from having a position in the administration. Yeah, Keith Kellogg. Keith Kellogg's leaving his post in January. And that was supposed to be the other pro-Ukraine voice that I remember getting told by other people on election night and some days following. Oh, don't worry. These are the types of voices that are going to be in the president's ear. Well, he's going to be gone in January, leaving little Marco as the sole voice in the room to say maybe we shouldn't give the Russians, the baby, the bathwater, and the bathroom, the whole house, the whole block, the whole neighborhood. So Marco's got a big task on his shoulders, and it will largely depend on his personal interest and whether or not he can sway the president over his real estate buddies. Annabelle, you can edit this out, can't you? Or you'll leave it in and make me look like a clown. Make me look like a clown. What is his name?